Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Peoples here, and today we're going to be talking about World War II and what life was like at home during the war. Your two learning targets for today are I can describe life on the home front before and during the war, and I can describe how Japanese Americans faced internment during the war. Internment also means imprisonment, being in prison or locked up where they couldn't get out. We'll talk about that here as we go. First thing, the United States, before World War II started, wanted to stay out of it. When Hitler started attacking places in Europe, the United States did want to stay out of it. Eventually, the United States got involved by sending weapons and supplies to Europe. But then Pearl Harbor happens. And when Pearl Harbor is attacked on December 7th, 1941, the United States, with both feet, jumps into World War II. They are committed to not only fighting the war, but winning the war. And that goes along with not just the soldiers who volunteered, but also the people at home who did things to make sure that the war would be won. An example of that would be businesses. Factories ran 24 hours a day. The farming of agriculture increased during this time period to farm food for the soldiers. The effort of preparing for war brought an end to the Great Depression. All of the things that Roosevelt tried before World War II, like the New Deal and the Second New Deal, all of those things, they helped, but the United States was still stuck in the Depression. It wasn't until the United States started to make things and prepare things for war until the United States came out of the Great Depression. So you had businesses putting into the war effort. You had soldiers. The Selective Service and Training Act of 1940 was the first peacetime draft. So even before Pearl Harbor was attacked, 16 million soldiers were drafted into the Army. By the end of the war, more than 16 million Americans served in the war. The government created a board called the War Production Board, to make sure that factories would convert over to war production. To pay for the war, taxes were increased, but also war bonds were sold. Just like we talked about in World War I, a war bond was a loan that you gave to the government that the government would pay back after the war. And then regular, good old-fashioned civilians, kids, women, elderly people collected scrap metal to be used in the war factories, and they learned to use less in order to supply the overseas troops. So it was something called rationing, where you could only buy a certain amount of things each month or each year. For example, you could only buy a pair of shoes per year. You could only gas up on certain weeks for your car. You could buy only a certain amount of flour or sugar for a certain time. You're going to get a chance to experience what rationing was like in class, because we're going to do a weekend where you're going to be asked to ration. Now, World War II also brought new opportunities for women and minorities. Minorities, again, in case you don't remember what they are, it's the group, the cultural group or racial group that is not the majority. So in this case, we're talking African Americans, Mexican Americans, and any other non-white group. So let's talk about women first. Women in the workforce. When World War II breaks out, women have new opportunities to go to work. Women were confined to a certain number of jobs, like secretary, teacher, things like that. But when World War II breaks out, women are asked by the government to go to war to fill the men's places in the workplace, so that those factories could still produce the war materials needed to win the war. And so women went to work in factories at jobs traditionally held by men. And we're talking about jobs like riveting pieces of metal together, which was required some strength to do. About 300,000, and then those women that didn't go into the workforce, women also went into the military. About 300,000 women served in the armed forces in non-combat positions. You had what were called the WACs, the WAACS. I'll help you see that here. So you got the WACs, WAACS. CS, the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps. They would do things like welcome the soldiers to their new base, see them off from the train station, secretarial duties, administration stuff. Then you had the WASPs, W-A-S-P. The WASPs, the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, these were women who were trained to be pilots, and they would fly materials and supplies from one place to another to help with the war effort. And so they weren't necessarily in combat positions, but they were taught to be pilots, something that women weren't expected or thought to be able to do before the war. And then Army and Navy nurses, of course, they served in combat areas. There were hospital ships where Navy nurses were on a ship off the coast of an island or something, where they would oftentimes get attacked by Japanese planes. And so they were right in the thick of things, same with the Army nurses as well. For African Americans in World War II, one of the things that was pushed for was that African Americans had fair treatment in the workplace. In some places, like in Mobile, Alabama, some of the factories tried to pay African American workers less. President Roosevelt eventually issues an order that prohibits racial discrimination in the government, in companies that are paid for by the government or producing war goods. And so Roosevelt issues that order that helps with some of the discrimination. And then African Americans, about 1 million African Americans serve in World War II. African Americans are forced to serve in segregated units, so they couldn't serve with white soldiers. Most often they were used for supplies and transport of supplies. In some cases they were put into combat, but very rare. One group, though, that served with distinction was the Tuskegee Airmen. They were African American pilots trained at Tuskegee Institute, and they were at first not given the opportunity to fly next to these bombers. They were fighter pilots, and bombing planes needed escorts to protect themselves, and that's where the fighter pilots would come in. And so the Tuskegee Airmen at first weren't allowed to fly those escort missions. Then they flew a mission, and one of the things that they did is they successfully stayed with their bombing planes. In the past, other pilots would, when German fighter planes would show up, they would go and try and chase the German fighter planes to try and get a kill. The Tuskegee Airmen stayed with the bombing planes, which made the bombing missions more successful. And because of that, the bombers requested the Tuskegee Airmen to fly with them, so that they knew that they would get back safely. And an amazing statistic is the Tuskegee Airmen never lost one single bombing plane to a German fighter, which is an amazing statistic for World War II. I'll show you a couple pictures here. This is a picture of the Tuskegee Airmen. Of course, there was a movie a couple years ago that came out about the Tuskegee Airmen, and you can, I believe it's rated PG-13, or maybe even rated R, but worth seeing if your parents allow you to see it. So there's a picture of some of the actual men, the Tuskegee Airmen. We actually at one point had a real live Tuskegee Airman living in the city of Duluth, and Channel 9 did a story on him. So you might want to check that out. You can probably check it on their webpage. And then the Benjamin O. Davis was the first African-American general of the U.S. Air Force after World War II, and he led the Tuskegee Airmen during the war. Mexican Americans in World War II, about 300,000 Mexican Americans served in the military. Many found wartime jobs on the West Coast and in the Midwest. Matter of fact, the government actually brought in farm workers from Mexico to work the farms. But there was also some problems. There was a youth culture that grew. The Mexican American youths that blended different music styles and clothing styles, and the most popular type of clothing style was the zoot suit, and you can see it here in the picture. Very loose-fitting outfit with an oversized hat, big chains, and unfortunately there was misunderstandings that took place in California during World War II, that in June of 1943, Mexican American young people were blamed for doing something they didn't do, and the soldiers left the base to try and go beat up these people dressed in zoot suits. It became known as the Zoot Suit Riots in June of 1943. Eventually, the riots ended when the commander of the base told the soldiers they couldn't leave the base at all. They were confined to the base, and that prevented some of the violence. But it was misunderstandings on both sides and prejudice, discrimination that caused those things to happen right in the middle of World War II. If you're interested in that, look up Zoot Suit riots, and there will be a lot of information about it. And then the biggest thing here we're going to talk about is the internment camps that the United States forced Japanese Americans to go to after Pearl Harbor. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, there were some Americans who began to look at Japanese Americans with fear and with suspicion. President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, and this allowed the government to begin the process of relocating Japanese Americans. About 115,000 Japanese Americans were forced from their homes and sent to isolated internment camps. Now, it's important to understand that there wasn't one German person, German American, who was sent to any kind of camps, even though we were also at war with Germany. But for the government said, for safety reasons, the Japanese Americans were evacuated from their homes and sent to these camps. And then the government also at first prevented Japanese Americans from serving in the military. But in 1943, that policy was reversed. And in 1943, the government came to these camps and asked the young men of these camps, would you like to serve in the war? And amazingly, 33,000 of them said yes. And they served in World War II, and they became one of the most decorated units of World War II. They were not sent to fight against Japan. They were sent to fight against Germany, did most of their combat in Italy is where they fought. And so these internment camps were like big camps. Unfortunately, there was plenty of food. There was shelter, not the best shelter. The wind would come through the woods or the wood planks of the buildings of the barracks. They weren't built very well because they were built so quickly, and they were built in places where the weather wasn't necessarily the best. And so although they had shelter and food, it wasn't an easy thing to do to live in these camps. And you can see some of the things on this picture. You can see a map where the camps were located. You can see the instructions to all Japanese Americans. And then you can see a picture of what one of the camps looked like. You're going to actually hear from people that lived in these camps in class. Okay, so again, your two learning targets were to describe how the United States at home helped with the war effort, and then to talk about Japanese, or be able to describe Japanese Americans being put in internment camps. Those were your two learning targets. Hopefully you can do